The chandeliers of Lord Pembroke's grand ballroom cast a golden glow over the sea of silks and satins below, illuminating the cream of London society as they whirled and preened in the spring of 1815. In a corner, partially concealed by a marble column, stood Lady Eleanor Blackwood, her 23 years weighing heavily upon her shoulders, as she observed the dancing with growing dread rather than delight. The ivory silk of her gown rustled softly as she shifted her weight, one gloved hand clutching her fan so tightly, her knuckles whitened beneath the delicate fabric. Her grey eyes, often praised for their intelligence and vivacity, now darted anxiously toward the entrance where her guardian, Lord Blacket, conversed with a gentleman whose very silhouette sent ice through her veins. Lord Warrington, 45 and twice widowed under circumstances polite society pretended not to question, was moving purposefully in her direction. His thin lips curved into what might generously be called a smile, but more accurately resembled the satisfied look of a predator cornering its prey. Eleanor felt her breath quicken, her stays suddenly too tight against her ribs as panic rose within her chest. 3 months of avoiding his company, of claiming headaches and prior engagements, had come to naught. Tonight, in this crowded ballroom with no possible escape route, her guardian intended to formalize the arrangement that would see her married to Warrington before summer's end, her modest dowry and family name exchanged for the cancellation of gambling debts she had never incurred. Lady Sophia Kent, her closest friend since childhood, appeared at her elbow with a glass of punch and a warning murmured too low for others to hear. Her gentle reminder to hold steady was accompanied by a significant glance toward the far end of the room, where a tall figure stood in conversation with their host. But Eleanor scarcely registered either the words or the look, for Warrington had nearly reached her, his cologne of tobacco and bergamot preceding him like a noxious cloud. In that moment of pure desperation, with her future closing in around her like the bars of a gilded cage, Eleanor made a decision born of panic and self-preservation. She waited until Lord Warrington was mere steps away, his hand already extending toward hers, before allowing her eyes to roll back and her body to go limp in a fluttering cascade of ivory silk and chestnut curls. The gasps of nearby ladies provided a satisfying accompaniment to her descent, though she took care to angle her collapse away from the marble column that might have caused genuine injury. As she lay motionless on the polished floor, eyes closed but senses alert, she heard Sophia whisper for her to remain steady as someone approached to help. What Eleanor could not see, as she maintained her facade of unconsciousness with remarkable commitment, was exactly who was coming to her assistance, or how this desperate ruse would alter the course of her life forever. The murmuring crowd around Eleanor suddenly fell silent, the orchestra faltering mid-note as the assembled nobility parted like the Red Sea before an approaching figure. Even with her eyes closed, Eleanor sensed the shift in the room, the collective intake of breath that signaled the arrival of someone of great consequence. Alexander Vane, the Duke of Thornfield, known throughout London for his icy demeanor and the darkness that seemed to follow him like a shadow, moved with purposeful strides toward the fallen woman. His tall figure cut an imposing silhouette against the candlelight, his evening attire impeccably tailored to broad shoulders and a frame hardened by years of fencing and riding, rather than softened by indulgence like many of his peers. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, whispers of a wife who had died under mysterious circumstances, of a heart turned to stone by tragedy, or perhaps by something far more sinister. The Winter Duke, they called him, for the perpetual chill that emanated from his grey eyes, and the frost that seemed to coat his words on the rare occasions he deigned to speak in society. Lord Warrington had backed away instinctively as the Duke approached, no man in London willing to challenge Thornfield directly no matter their own standing. With movements that brooked no argument, the Duke knelt beside Eleanor, his gloved hands sliding beneath her shoulders and knees. "Stand aside," he commanded, his deep voice cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. "The lady needs air." Before Eleanor could break her pretense and protest, she felt herself lifted from the ballroom floor as effortlessly as if she were made of feathers rather than flesh and bone. Her eyes flew open in shock, meeting for one breathless moment the steel-grey gaze of Alexander Vane, close enough now that she could see the flecks of silver near his pupils and the slight scar that traced his right temple into his dark hair. Recognition flashed in his eyes, not of her identity but of her deception, a knowing that transformed his austere features for the briefest instant before his mask of indifference returned. Eleanor felt her heart seize with a new kind of panic as she realized whose arms now cradled her against a chest solid as marble and just as cold. The Duke of Thornfield was the one man in London more dangerous to her than Warrington could ever be, not for any threat of physical harm but for the inexplicable power he seemed to hold over her senses whenever their paths crossed. Despite his fearsome reputation, despite the rumors that surrounded his first marriage, despite the absolute impropriety of their current position, Eleanor found herself unable to look away from his face, her body responding with treacherous warmth to his proximity. Through the grand ballroom he carried her, the crowd creating a path before them, her ivory skirts trailing over his arm as they vanished through doors that led deeper into Lord Pembroke's mansion, away from the protection of the crowd and toward chambers unknown, where she would be entirely at the mercy of the Winter Duke. The Duke carried Eleanor through several corridors, his stride never faltering despite her weight in his arms, until they reached a handsomely appointed study, clearly reserved for his personal use during visits to Lord Pembroke's mansion. A fire blazed in the marble hearth, casting dancing shadows across walls lined with leather-bound books and hunting trophies, the room exuding a distinctly masculine energy, with its deep mahogany furniture and the lingering scent of brandy and sandalwood. Without ceremony, he deposited her onto a burgundy chaise lounge, positioned near enough to the fire for warmth, but not so close as to cause discomfort, then straightened to his considerable height, and regarded her with those penetrating grey eyes that seemed to strip away all pretense. "Your performance was quite convincing, Lady Blackwood," he said, his voice deep and surprisingly melodious despite its coolness. "But I recognize a tactical retreat when I see one." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the nearby flames, mortification washing over her at being so thoroughly discovered in her deception. She pushed herself into a sitting position, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands as she struggled to formulate a response that might salvage her dignity. Before she could speak, the door opened to admit a severe-looking butler who carried a silver tray bearing a glass of water, his expression betraying neither surprise nor curiosity at finding his master alone with a young woman in apparent distress. "We require privacy," the Duke said without looking away from Eleanor, his tone making it clear this was not a request but a command. "The lady is not as ill as she appears." The butler bowed stiffly and withdrew without comment, the soft click of the door marking the moment Eleanor found herself truly alone with the most feared man in London society. She swallowed hard, acutely aware of her vulnerability, of the impropriety of their situation, and of the strange flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the way the firelight caught the angles of the Duke's face, softening his harsh features just enough to reveal the handsome man beneath the forbidding exterior. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions, until Eleanor gathered her courage and lifted her chin to meet his unwavering gaze. What she saw there was not the condemnation she expected, nor the cold disdain for which he was famous, but something altogether more unsettling, a glimmer of what might have been understanding, perhaps even amusement, though it vanished so quickly she could not be certain she had not imagined it. The Duke of Thornfield moved to stand before the fireplace, his tall figure silhouetted against the flames, one hand resting on the mantelpiece in a pose that spoke of casual authority as he prepared to speak words that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. The Duke remained by the fireplace, studying Eleanor with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts, while the heavy ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner marked each passing moment with solemn precision. "I am aware of your circumstances, Lady Blackwood," he said finally, his voice low enough that it would not carry beyond the closed door, yet clear enough that each word struck her like a physical blow. "Your guardian, Lord Blackett, has accumulated considerable gambling debts, primarily to Lord Warrington, who has agreed to forgive those debts in exchange for your hand in marriage." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, mortification washing over her, that this man, this virtual stranger, despite his prominence in society, knew of her humiliating situation, of her being bartered like cattle to satisfy debts not of her making. The grandfather clock continued its relentless ticking, filling the silence that stretched between them as she struggled to maintain her composure. When she finally found her voice, it emerged as little more than a whisper. "How could you possibly know this, Your Grace?" The Duke moved away from the fireplace, his steps measured as he crossed to a small table where a decanter of amber liquid gleamed in the firelight. "I make it my business to know many things, Lady Blackwood, particularly when they involve men like Warrington." He poured a small measure into a crystal glass but did not drink, merely holding it as if drawing comfort from its presence. "I have a proposition that would solve your predicament, Lady Blackwood," he continued, turning to face her with an expression that remained impossible to decipher. "Marry me instead." The words hung in the air between them, so unexpected that Eleanor was certain she had misheard. The grandfather clock ticked on, marking 5 full seconds of stunned silence before she managed to respond. "Marry you, Your Grace? But why would you?" The Duke cut off her question with a raised hand, his long fingers elegant despite their obvious strength. "A marriage of convenience," he clarified, his tone matter-of-fact as if discussing the weather rather than a life-altering arrangement. "You would have my protection, my name, and financial security. In return, I require a hostess for social functions and an heir in due course. You need not fear the same fate as Lord Warrington's previous wives." Eleanor felt her mind spinning with conflicting emotions, terror warring with desperate hope as she considered his offer. On one hand stood the Duke of Thornfield, cold and enigmatic, rumoured to have been somehow responsible for his first wife's tragic end, a man whose very presence in a room caused the temperature to drop. On the other hand was Lord Warrington, whose cruelty was not rumour but established fact, whose 2 previous wives had died within years of their marriages, whose grasping hands and leering eyes promised a future of degradation and misery. The clock ticked on, each second bringing her closer to a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of her life, trapping her between fear of this mysterious Duke and her desperate need to escape Warrington's clutches. The grand ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath as Eleanor re-entered on the arm of the Duke of Thornfield, her gloved hand trembling slightly where it rested against his sleeve. In their absence, speculation had spread like wildfire through the assembly, whispers fluttering behind fans and murmured over champagne glasses with increasing fervour. The music continued, couples still whirled across the polished floor, but eyes darted continuously toward the doors until the moment they appeared, whereupon a visible ripple of interest moved through the crowd like wind across a wheat field. "Did you see?" Lady Pembroke hissed to her companion as they passed. Thornfield himself carried her away. What could it mean? Another voice, less discreet, wondered aloud if poor Lady Blackwood had truly recovered from her spell, while a third suggested with knowing insinuation that perhaps the spell had been feigned for the very purpose of securing the Duke's attention. Eleanor kept her gaze fixed forward, her face composed into a mask of dignified calm that belied the tumult within her breast. She had given the Duke her answer before they left his private study, accepting his extraordinary proposal with a single whispered yes that had sealed her fate more irrevocably than any formal contract. Now she moved beside him through the crowd, acutely conscious of his towering presence, of the slight pressure of his hand over hers, of how the sea of revellers parted before them with a deference born of both respect and fear. Lord Blackett, her guardian since her parents' death 5 years prior, intercepted them before they could reach the refreshment table, his florid face mottled with barely contained fury, and his eyes darting nervously between his ward and the imposing Duke. "What is the meaning of this, Eleanor?" he demanded, his voice pitched low but sharp with anger. "Where have you been, and why are you now parading about with His Grace as if Lord Warrington is not searching for you this very moment?" Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but found herself forestalled by the Duke, whose voice carried just far enough to reach the ears of those nearby without becoming a spectacle. "Lady Blackwood has done me the honour of accepting my proposal of marriage, Lord Blackett," he stated with cool authority, making any further pursuit by Lord Warrington both inappropriate and unnecessary. A small circle of silence expanded around them, as those within earshot registered his words, then contracted again as whispers exploded outward, carrying the shocking news to the farthest corners of the ballroom. Lord Blackett's face transformed from anger to astonishment, to calculation within seconds, his mind visibly working through the implications of this unexpected development, weighing the loss of Warrington's debt forgiveness against the infinitely more valuable connection to a dukedom. Thornfield watched this progression with evident disdain before turning slightly toward the approaching figure of Lord Warrington himself, whose expression darkened with each step as the news reached his ears and comprehension dawned on his features. The pale morning light filtered reluctantly through the worn damask curtains of Eleanor's modest townhouse in Bloomsbury, her last remaining inheritance from parents whose deaths had left her at the mercy of a guardian who valued coins above care. She paced the faded carpet of her bedchamber, her nightgown swishing softly around her ankles as doubt gnawed at her resolve with each passing hour since the extraordinary events at Lord Pembroke's ball. Had she traded one form of imprisonment for another, perhaps one even more inescapable? The Duke of Thornfield might offer protection from Lord Warrington, but his reputation whispered of dangers of a different sort, of a coldness that went beyond mere social reserve, of a darkness that had swallowed his first wife whole. Martha, her faithful lady's maid since childhood, entered with a breakfast tray, and concern etched across her careworn features as she observed her mistress's agitation. "They call him the Winter Duke for a reason, miss," she cautioned as she poured steaming tea into a chipped porcelain cup, her voice low as if the very walls might carry tales to aristocratic ears. "His heart is said to be ice." Eleanor accepted the tea with trembling hands, the weight of her decision pressing upon her chest like a physical burden. Why would such a man, wealthy and titled beyond imagination, offer marriage to a woman whose fortune had dwindled to nothing more than this narrow house and its faded furnishings? What purpose could lie behind his proposition beyond the simple explanation he had provided? Her restless movements carried her to the small rosewood secretary where her father's private papers had been stored, untouched since his passing. Some instinct, some whisper of memory prompted her to unlock the drawer with the tiny key she kept on a ribbon around her neck, her fingers sifting through documents until they closed upon a sealed letter addressed in her father's distinctive hand, for Eleanor, to be opened in the event of an approach from the Vane family. With heart pounding, she broke the seal and unfolded the yellowed parchment, her father's words leaping from the page with startling clarity despite the 5 years that had passed since his death. "My dearest daughter, beware any overture from Alexander Vane or his family. There exists between our houses a conflict dating back to my early medical practice, a matter concerning his late wife that he has neither forgiven nor forgotten. If he approaches you, it cannot be with honorable intentions." Eleanor sank into the nearby chair, the letter trembling in her grasp as pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed suddenly rearranged themselves in her mind. The Duke had not chosen her by chance or convenience, but deliberately, perhaps seeking some form of revenge for a wrong her father had allegedly committed. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 10, each resonant chime marking another hour closer to her impending marriage to a man whose true motives now seemed as shadowed and dangerous as his reputation. The journey to Thornfield Hall took Eleanor through increasingly desolate countryside, the roads narrowing and the villages growing sparser until they vanished altogether, replaced by vast snow-covered moors that stretched endlessly beneath a slate-grey sky. When the ducal carriage finally crested the final hill, Eleanor felt her breath catch at the sight of the ancestral seat of the Vane family, a sprawling Gothic structure of dark stone with towers and turrets that seemed to pierce the low-hanging winter clouds. Thornfield Hall stood like a sentinel against the bleak landscape, windows glinting like watchful eyes, chimneys belching smoke that vanished into the colourless sky above. As the carriage rolled through wrought-iron gates tall enough to admit giants, Eleanor could not suppress a shiver that had nothing to do with the December chill. This imposing edifice, this monument to centuries of aristocratic power, would soon be her home, yet never had she felt smaller or more insignificant than in its looming shadow. The Duke himself had not accompanied her on this visit preceding their wedding, sending instead a retinue of servants to attend to her needs while he concluded business in London. An elderly butler helped her descend from the carriage with formal precision, his face betraying neither welcome nor disdain, as he escorted her into a vast entrance hall, where suits of armor stood like silent sentinels along walls, hung with ancient tapestries depicting hunting scenes of uncommon violence. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, awaited her there, a tall woman with iron-grey hair pulled severely back from a face as unyielding as the stone walls around them. Her Kirsty was correct in form, but entirely lacking in warmth, her pale eyes assessing Eleanor with undisguised skepticism as she welcomed Lady Blackwood to Thornfield Hall. "I will show you to your chambers," she said, her voice as cold and dry as the winter air outside, though I confess we had little time to prepare, given the hastiness of the engagement. Eleanor followed the housekeeper up a grand staircase, trying not to feel like an intruder in the house that would soon be under her nominal authority. As they traversed a long gallery lined with portraits of vain ancestors, all bearing the same aristocratic features and cool grey eyes, Eleanor noticed one painting partially concealed behind a velvet curtain, as if someone had attempted to hide it from casual view, but had been interrupted in the process. She glimpsed just enough to see it depicted a woman of extraordinary beauty, with raven hair and striking grey eyes that matched the Duke's precisely, her smile holding a secret that seemed to follow Eleanor as she moved past. "The master does not marry for love, Lady Blackwood," Mrs. Winters stated abruptly as they reached the door to Eleanor's chambers, not turning to face her, but speaking to the heavy oak panel as she pushed it open. "Do not expect warmth in these halls." The vastness of Thornfield Hall, with its endless corridors and closed doors, might have intimidated Eleanor into remaining in her chambers, but an explorer's spirit inherited from her father drove her to venture forth on her second morning at the estate. Her wanderings led her to a pair of ornately carved doors that opened onto a library of such magnificent proportions that she gasped aloud, momentarily forgetting her troubled circumstances. 2 stories of leather-bound volumes lined the walls, accessible by a wrought-iron spiral staircase and rolling ladders that invited exploration. The scent of aged paper, leather, and beeswax polish created an atmosphere at once scholarly and comforting, reminding Eleanor powerfully of her father's much smaller but equally cherished collection. She moved through the space with reverent steps, fingers trailing along spines embossed with gold lettering, pausing occasionally to examine particularly interesting titles. So absorbed was she, in a rare first edition of Homer's Iliad, that she failed to notice the Duke's entrance until his shadow fell across the page. "Your Grace," she acknowledged, startled into nearly dropping the precious volume as she attempted to curtsy while holding the book. Alexander Vane stood before her in riding attire, his tall frame silhouetted against the library entrance, his expression unreadable as always, yet somehow less severe than she remembered from London. "You have an interest in Greek classics, Lady Blackwood," he observed, his voice neither approving nor condemning but holding a note of unmistakable surprise. "My father collected first editions," she replied, carefully closing the volume and replacing it on its shelf. "I thought they were simply for show until I opened one." She did not add that those books had been sold one by one to pay for her father's funeral and her guardian's debts, leaving her only with memories of their contents rather than the treasured objects themselves. Something shifted in the Duke's countenance then, a subtle change that might have gone unnoticed had Eleanor not been studying him so intently. Just as the perpetual winter clouds outside parted momentarily to allow a shaft of golden sunlight to penetrate the library's stained glass windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the suddenly vibrant air, so too did a hint of warmth penetrate the Duke's customary frost. "The Iliad is superior in its original Greek," he said, crossing to a glass-fronted case that Eleanor had not yet explored and retrieving a smaller, older volume bound in cracked leather. "Homer captures the tragedy of Hector's fall in language that defies adequate translation." The reverence with which he handled the ancient text and the unexpected passion in his voice as he began to recite from memory in fluent Greek revealed to Eleanor a glimpse of the man beneath the Duke's forbidding exterior, a man of education and sensitivity so at odds with his reputation that she found herself momentarily speechless, watching in fascination as sunlight caught the angles of his face and transformed severity into something approaching beauty. The snowstorm that had threatened all day finally descended upon Thornfield Hall with full fury on Eleanor's third evening, confining her to the vast manor and prompting her to explore corridors she had not yet ventured down. A wrong turn after dinner led her into the East Wing, a section of the house noticeably less maintained than the rest, with faded carpets and wall sconces that remained unlit, casting the hallway in shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the panelled walls. Portraits of vain ancestors lined this corridor, their stern faces barely visible in the gloom, yet their eyes seeming to track her movements with silent disapproval as she passed beneath them. Eleanor had nearly decided to turn back when she heard voices from behind a partially open door at the end of the hallway, one unmistakably belonging to the Duke, the other female and unfamiliar. She must never know what happened. Alexander, the female voice insisted with evident distress. It would destroy any chance of this marriage succeeding. "Do you think I'm unaware of that?" came the Duke's response, his tone harsher than Eleanor had ever heard it, even in his most forbidding moments. The knowledge would send her fleeing back to London before morning. Eleanor froze, understanding with absolute certainty that she was the subject of this conversation, that some secret regarding her impending marriage was being deliberately kept from her. Heart pounding, she backed away from the door, only to collide with a small table, sending a porcelain figurine crashing to the floor, with a sound that echoed through the silent corridor like a gunshot. The voices behind the door ceased instantly, followed by hurried footsteps. Eleanor turned to flee, but found herself at a locked door, her escape cut off as the Duke emerged from the room, his face transformed by anger into something truly frightening. "Lady Blackwood," he said, his voice low and controlled but vibrating with barely suppressed fury, "you have wandered far from the main hall." Eleanor lifted her chin despite her trembling knees, determined not to cower before him despite the genuine fear his expression evoked. "I became lost, Your Grace," she explained. "This house is vast and unfamiliar to me." The Duke studied her face with penetrating intensity, clearly seeking to determine how much she might have overheard. His gaze then moved pointedly to the locked door behind her, its heavy oak panel bearing ornate carvings and a black iron lock that appeared both ancient and impenetrable. "There are secrets in this house that would make you flee, Lady Blackwood," he said finally, his voice dropping to little more than a whisper that somehow proved more terrifying than a shout. "For your own safety, do not seek them out." The news of Lady Eleanor Blackwood's engagement to the Duke of Thornfield spread through London society like wildfire, igniting speculation that blazed through drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs alike. The match was deemed incomprehensible by most, not because Eleanor lacked breeding or beauty, but because the Duke had shown no previous interest in matrimony since the mysterious end of his first marriage. A union so rarely mentioned, it had faded to little more than shadow in society's collective memory. Eleanor herself had returned to London for the fitting of her wedding clothes, standing now in Madame Delacroix's fashionable shop on Bond Street as seamstresses swarmed around her with pins and measuring tapes, draping luxurious fabrics across her slender form while discussing her transformation into a duchess as if she were not present. The ivory silk for the wedding gown itself had been selected by the Duke, delivered with a note specifying certain requirements about the design, but offering no personal message to his bride-to-be. Eleanor stared at her reflection in the trifold mirror, her expression betraying the conflict that had grown within her breast since her stay at Thornfield Hall, fear of the approaching marriage warring with the unexpected moments of connection she had experienced with Alexander during their few private conversations, particularly in the library, where he had revealed a depth of intellect and sensitivity at odds with his forbidding reputation. Her contemplation was interrupted by the shop's door opening to admit Lady Warrington, mother of the man she had so narrowly escaped, whose face twisted with malicious satisfaction upon spotting Eleanor among the bolts of fabric and half-completed gowns. The older woman crossed the shop floor with determined steps, her voice pitched low enough that only Eleanor and the nearest seamstress could hear her words, forcing Madame Delacroix's assistant to quickly busy herself elsewhere. "You've made a deal with the devil, my dear," Lady Warrington hissed, her breath smelling faintly of sherry despite the early hour. "Hell destroy you as he did his first wife." Eleanor felt her blood chill at this confirmation of the rumors she had dismissed as spiteful gossip, her hands clutching instinctively at the silk draped across her bodice as if seeking protection from the woman's venom. Lady Warrington smiled coldly at Eleanor's evident shock, clearly savouring the moment as she continued her assault in hushed tones, describing how the Duke's first wife had been found dead in circumstances never fully explained to society, how the investigation had been quietly abandoned after influential interventions, how Alexander Vane had transformed from a man of warmth and promise into the cold figure now known as the Winter Duke. The eve of her wedding found Eleanor seated before the fire in her chambers at Thornfield Hall, watching shadows dance across walls papered in faded crimson damask, as a winter wind howled beyond leaded glass windows. Candles flickered in silver holders throughout the room, their golden light softening the austerity of ancient furniture that had witnessed centuries of vain brides preparing for their wedding days. A soft knock preceded the Duke's entrance, his tall figure momentarily filling the doorway before he stepped inside, still formally dressed though the hour grew late. He carried a small wooden box of evident age, its surface polished by generations of handling until the wood gleamed like satin in the candlelight. Eleanor rose to greet him, her cream-colored dressing gown rustling softly as she curtsied, intensely aware of the impropriety of his presence in her bedchamber, yet somehow unafraid, despite all she had learned and all she still did not know. Without preamble, Alexander approached and opened the box to reveal a necklace of such extraordinary craftsmanship that Eleanor could not suppress a small gasp of appreciation. Sapphires and diamonds arranged in an intricate pattern of vines and flowers caught the firelight, transforming into a cascade of blue flame and brilliant white stars against the black velvet lining. "This has adorned the neck of every Thornfield bride for 3 centuries, he said, his deep voice unusually gentle as he lifted the necklace from its resting place. "Tomorrow it shall be yours." With steady hands that belied the tension Eleanor sensed in him, the Duke moved behind her, placing the cold stones against her throat and securing the clasp with fingers that brushed the sensitive skin at her nape, sending an involuntary shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. When he turned her to face the looking-glass, his hands remaining on her shoulders, Eleanor was struck not by her own reflection with the magnificent jewels at her throat, but by the expression in Alexander's eyes as they met hers in the mirror. For one unguarded moment, the perpetual winter of his countenance thawed, revealing such naked longing and something that might almost have been tenderness that Eleanor felt her heart constrict with an emotion she dared not name. The moment shattered as quickly as it had formed, the Duke withdrawing both his hands and his momentary openness, his mask of cool indifference sliding back into place as he bid her good night, and departed with formal correctness. Later, as Eleanor prepared for bed, she paused at hearing hushed voices in the corridor outside her door, servants passing with linens for the guest chambers. "Such a lovely girl," whispered one. "I pray she fares better than the last one." "Hush now," came the sharp response. "You know we don't speak of the tragedy. The poor Duchess deserved better than to be forgotten." Eleanor stood frozen by her bedside, the sapphires now locked safely in their box, seeming suddenly heavy with the weight of unseen history, of secrets that surrounded her like the winter mists that shrouded Thornfield Hall. The chapel at Thornfield Hall stood transformed on the wedding morning, winter roses in ivory and palest blue arranged in elaborate displays along stone walls that had witnessed vain marriages for generations. Through stained glass windows depicting biblical scenes of both salvation and judgment, Eleanor could see snow falling in thick white flakes, adding to the sense of isolation that had characterized her time at the estate. The small gathering of witnesses, primarily local gentry, and a handful of London acquaintances willing to make the arduous winter journey, rose as the chapel doors opened to admit the bride. Eleanor paused at the threshold, her ivory silk gown catching the light from hundreds of candles as she contemplated the irrevocability of the step she was about to take. She could still flee, a small voice whispered in her mind, disappear into the snowstorm before binding herself to a man whose secrets multiplied with every passing day. Yet even as the thought formed, her eyes found Alexander waiting at the altar, his tall figure resplendent in formal attire, his expression as she approached revealing a vulnerability she had glimpsed only in rare, unguarded moments. With resolve that surprised even herself, Eleanor moved forward down the aisle, each step bringing her closer to a future shrouded in mystery, but increasingly tinged with hope born of those brief connections they had shared. The ancient stone chapel amplified their voices as they spoke the traditional vows, the Duke's I do carrying through the sacred space with unexpected fervor, a warmth and certainty that contradicted everything society believed about the Winter Duke. When the moment came to exchange rings, Eleanor was startled by the warmth of Alexander's hands as they enveloped hers, his skin not cold as his moniker suggested, but radiating a heat that seemed to flow directly into her veins, warming her from within, despite the chapel's perpetual chill. As the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Eleanor became aware of movement at the back of the congregation, her attention drawn to a woman she had not noticed before, wrapped in a dark cloak with its hood partially concealing her features. Something in the woman's posture suggested familiarity with Thornfield, an ease within its walls that spoke of long acquaintance rather than casual visitation. When the woman realized she had caught Eleanor's attention, she turned abruptly and slipped through the side door, her hasty departure creating a momentary draft that caused the nearest candles to flicker wildly, casting strange, elongated shadows across the ancient stones. Eleanor had no time to dwell on the mysterious figure, however, as Alexander took her arm to lead her back down the aisle, now as the Duchess of Thornfield, a title that carried with it both the weight of centuries of tradition and the promise of a future she could not yet fully envision. The ducal chambers assigned to Eleanor as the new Duchess of Thornfield were both sumptuous and ancient, the walls adorned with richly woven tapestries depicting hunting scenes and mythological tableaux that seemed to shift and move in the dancing firelight. She sat before the ornate vanity, as Martha removed the last of the pins from her hair, allowing chestnut waves to fall freely down her back, when a firm knock announced the arrival of her husband. Martha quickly gathered her things and slipped out through a side door as the Duke entered, still formally attired, though he had removed his cravat, the open collar revealing a glimpse of tanned skin at his throat. Eleanor rose to face him, her heart pounding with a mixture of trepidation and something far more dangerous, an anticipation she dared not examine too closely. Alexander remained near the door, maintaining a careful distance as his grey eyes took in her appearance, the simple white nightgown covered by a silk robe that had been part of her modest trousseau. "This marriage will be in name only, Eleanor," he said finally, his voice low but clear in the hushed chamber. "I will not claim my rights." The words hung in the space between them, their meanings slowly penetrating her consciousness with complex effect. Relief came first, a loosening of the tension that had wound her body tight as a clock spring throughout the day. Yet following close behind was an unexpected and decidedly improper disappointment that heated her cheeks and forced her to turn toward the fire to hide her expression. The flames highlighted the rich colors of the tapestries, bringing to life hunters and prey locked in eternal pursuit across landscapes of thread and imagination. "Why did you really marry me, Your Grace?" she asked softly, watching the shadows leap across the ancient weaving rather than meeting his gaze. "It wasn't just to save me from Lord Warrington." She heard him move, not toward her, but to the side table where crystal decanters caught the firelight, transforming ordinary glass into vessels of captured flame. The sound of liquid pouring was followed by silence before he spoke again, his voice containing an emotion she could not immediately identify. "Because some debts can never be repaid, but they can be honored," he said finally, the cryptic words offering more questions than answers. Eleanor turned to find him watching her, the glass untouched in his hand, his expression a complex mixture of resolve and regret, of secrets still kept and truths hovering just beyond articulation. Behind him, the tapestry depicting Actaeon transformed into a stag for glimpsing the forbidden seemed suddenly appropriate, a warning embroidered centuries ago for this very moment when Eleanor stood on the threshold of discoveries that might prove equally transformative, equally dangerous. The great hall of Thornfield blazed with light and warmth as winter gave way to early spring, the ancient stone walls, witnessing a celebration unlike any seen in recent memory, as tenant farmers and their families gathered to feast at the invitation of their new duchess. 3 months into her unexpected marriage, Eleanor had taken to her duties with a natural aptitude that surprised even Mrs. Winters. the dour housekeeper gradually softening toward the young woman who approached estate accounts and tenant concerns with genuine interest rather than aristocratic indifference. Eleanor moved among the gathered families now, learning names and circumstances, addressing concerns about leaking roofs and ailing livestock with practical solutions that earned her nods of approval from the estate manager. From her position near the enormous fireplace, she observed Alexander as he conversed with a group of farmers, his customary reserve still present yet somehow less forbidding within these walls, among people who clearly respected rather than feared him. A commotion near the dessert table drew her attention, as a small boy who had been attempting to reach a particularly tempting tart lost his balance and fell, striking his head against the edge of the heavy oak. Before Eleanor could move, Alexander was there, kneeling beside the child without regard for his fine clothing, examining the injury with gentle hands and soothing words that calmed both the boy and his distressed mother. He produced a handkerchief to stem the bleeding from a small cut, then lifted the child into his arms and carried him to a quiet alcove, where he personally applied a plaster and offered a tart as consolation for the injury. Eleanor felt something shift within her chest at this display of tenderness so at odds with society's perception of the Winter Duke. An elderly woman beside her, gnarled hands wrapped around a cup of spiced cider, followed her gaze with knowing eyes. "The master wasn't always winter, my lady," she said softly, her voice carrying the wisdom of decades spent at Thornfield. There was a time when spring reigned at Thornfield. Before Eleanor could inquire further, Alexander approached them, offering his arm to the elderly tenant with a respect that spoke of long acquaintance, asking after her grandchildren by name and promising to have the leak in her cottage roof addressed before the next rainfall. As he guided the woman to a comfortable seat near the fire, his eyes met Eleanor's across the crowded hall, a moment of unguarded connection that sent warmth flooding through her veins despite the lingering chill of early March. The curiosity that had drawn her to investigate the mysteries of Thornfield and its master now deepened into something far more dangerous, an attraction that could not be explained away by gratitude or circumstance, a yearning to discover not just the secrets of his past, but the man himself, hidden beneath layers of grief and reserve, like the first crocuses pushing through frost-hardened earth. A chance turn down an unfamiliar corridor during her 4th month at Thornfield led Eleanor to a discovery that would forever alter her understanding of her husband. A small door, partially concealed behind a tapestry and seemingly unused for years, yielded to her curious touch, revealing a circular room tucked into one of the mansion's forgotten turrets. Sunlight filtered through dust-streaked windows, illuminating dancing motes that swirled in air undisturbed for what must have been years, settling on white sheets that partially covered dozens of canvases arranged throughout the space. Eleanor moved through the room with cautious steps, drawing back one sheet and then another to reveal portraits of extraordinary skill and sensitivity, each depicting the same raven-haired beauty whose grey eyes matched Alexander's precisely, the woman from the partially hidden painting she had glimpsed during her first days at Thornfield. The style was unmistakable, the brushwork bearing the same confident strokes she had observed in the Duke's handwriting, confirming what seemed impossible, that Alexander himself had created these works of devotion. Some showed the woman laughing in sunlit gardens that Eleanor recognized as the now neglected East grounds. Others captured her reading by candlelight or gazing pensively from windows that overlooked the moors. But all conveyed such profound love that Eleanor felt like an intruder, witnessing something sacred and deeply personal. She stood transfixed before a particularly striking portrait of the woman in a blue gown, the exact shade of the sapphires Eleanor now wore, her expression one of such happiness that it made the heart ache to behold it. "So you've discovered his weakness at last," came Mrs. Winter's voice from the doorway, causing Eleanor to turn with guilt coloring her cheeks at being caught in this clearly private sanctuary. The housekeeper entered the room with steps that suggested familiarity, her usual severity softened by something like sorrow as she gazed at the portraits surrounding them. "The first Duchess of Thornfield, Lucia Vane," she explained without prompting, "the master's wife for barely 2 years before tragedy claimed her, Mrs. Winters moved to straighten a sheet that had slipped to the floor, her movements respectful rather than efficient as she continued her tale, revealing how deeply Alexander had loved his young bride. How her death, under circumstances never fully explained, had transformed him from a man of warmth and promise into the cold figure now known throughout society as the Winter Duke. Eleanor listened with growing distress, each word driving home the painful truth that she had unwittingly entered a household still mourning its true mistress, that the man she had gradually come to admire, and increasingly to desire, remained devoted to a ghost whose presence filled this hidden room more completely than she herself could ever hope to fill Thornfield Hall as Mrs. Winters departed. Leaving Eleanor alone among the paintings, she confronted the realization that had been building within her heart for weeks, the impossible, inconvenient truth that she was falling in love with a husband whose heart remained entombed with his first wife, preserved like these portraits behind locks and sheets, beautiful but untouchable. A violent storm descended upon Thornfield that night, lightning slashing the darkness with brilliant white fury that illuminated the grounds in stark relief before plunging them back into shadow. Eleanor found Alexander in his study, standing before the great windows that overlooked the moors, his tall figure silhouetted against the tempestuous sky, as thunder shook the ancient glass in its leaded frames. She closed the heavy door behind her with deliberate firmness, announcing her presence in a way that caused him to turn, his face momentarily illuminated by another lightning strike, revealing features tight with some internal struggle that matched the warring elements outside. "I found the portrait room today," she said without preamble, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart against her ribs. "The paintings of your first wife, your Lucia." Alexander remained motionless, only the slight tightening of his hand on the crystal tumbler he held betraying his reaction as Eleanor continued, moving closer with each word until she stood directly before him, close enough to see the muscle working in his jaw. "You loved her beyond measure, that much is clear in every brushstroke, yet her name is never spoken at Thornfield, her portrait hidden away, her memory shrouded in whispers and half-truths." Lightning flashed again, thunder following almost immediately, the storm now directly overhead as Eleanor gathered her courage for the question that had haunted her since discovering the hidden room. "Did you kill her, Alexander?" she asked, her voice dropping to little more than a whisper that somehow carried over the raging tempest. "Is that why you hide behind your winter?" The crystal tumbler shattered in his hand, amber liquid and glass fragments scattering across the carpet as Alexander rounded on her with such fury that Eleanor instinctively stepped back, truly frightened of him for the first time since their marriage. "How dare you?" he began, his voice rising to match the thunder, grey eyes blazing with a fire that belied his Winter Duke moniker. But as quickly as the rage had ignited, it collapsed, leaving him suddenly looking older, his shoulders slumping as he turned away from her to brace himself against the mantelpiece. "I did worse than kill her," he said finally, his voice so raw with pain that Eleanor felt it like a physical wound to her own heart. "I failed to save her." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across his tormented features as he finally revealed the truth, how his beloved Lucia had descended into melancholia after losing their unborn child, how her grief had consumed her until one winter morning she had walked onto the frozen lake and broken through the ice, how he had been too late to save her, arriving only in time to witness her final moments. "It was my child too," he said, his voice breaking on the words, "yet I could not share her grief properly, could not reach her through the darkness that claimed her, and so I lost them both, my wife and my son, to waters that should have claimed me as well." The locked door in the east wing yielded at last to Alexander's key, revealing a room Eleanor had never imagined despite her explorations of Thornfield Hall. A nursery, perfectly preserved as if awaiting the arrival of its tiny occupant, stood frozen in time with a cradle carved from dark walnut, tiny garments laid out upon a changing table, and stuffed animals arranged with loving care upon shelves that had gathered no dust thanks to Mrs. Winter's vigilant attention. Moonlight streamed through windows uncovered by curtains, bathing the untouched sanctuary in silver light that gave the space an otherworldly quality, as if it existed between reality and dream. Alexander moved through the room with reverent steps, his fingers trailing across the cradle with a tenderness that made Eleanor's heart ache. "Your father was the physician who could have saved them both," he said softly, his voice carrying in the stillness of the preserved nursery. "He was called away to another patient, your mother." The words struck Eleanor with physical force, pieces of a puzzle suddenly snapping together with devastating clarity as she understood at last the connection between their families, the reason Alexander had chosen her specifically when he might have married any woman in London. Her father, renowned for his skill in difficult childbirths, had been summoned to Thornfield when Lucia began hemorrhaging after delivering a stillborn son. But the message had arrived while he attended Eleanor's own mother, whose prolonged labor with a younger sibling who had not survived had left her weakened but alive. While he saved one mother, he lost another, a choice that had never truly been a choice at all, but which had altered the course of multiple lives nonetheless. Alexander turned to face her, his expression more open than she had ever seen it, raw with both remembered pain and something new, something that made her breath catch in her throat. "I came to this marriage seeking revenge," he confessed, the words seeming to be torn from him against his will, believing some cosmic justice would be served by binding the daughter of the man who failed my Lucia to a life with the husband who equally failed her. His voice broke as he continued, "But I found something I thought dead within me." Eleanor stood motionless, tears streaming unchecked down her face as she absorbed the terrible truth that she had been chosen not for herself but as an instrument of vengeance. Yet something had changed in the months since their hasty wedding, something that now shone in Alexander's eyes as he closed the distance between them with hesitant steps. Her heart, which should have been shattered by his revelation, instead beat with painful hope as she recognized in his expression the same emotion that had been growing within her own breast, fragile and unexpected as the first shoots of spring emerging from winter-hardened ground. The peace that had begun to form between Alexander and Eleanor in the wake of his painful confession was shattered 3 nights later, when a violent storm descended upon Thornfield, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling through ancient chimneys like tortured spirits seeking release. The couple had retired to the library after dinner, Eleanor reading by firelight while Alexander reviewed estate accounts, the comfortable silence between them a new and fragile thing, when the distant pounding on the main door echoed through the halls. Moments later, the butler appeared with evident distress to announce Lord Warrington, who pushed past the servant with mud-spattered clothes and the unmistakable reek of brandy emanating from his person. His face was mottled with rage and drink as he stumbled into the library, pointing an accusatory finger at Alexander, who had risen to his full height at this unexpected intrusion. "I know what you did to her," Warrington slurred, his eyes wild as they darted between the Duke and Eleanor. "I have proof at last. Evidence that will see you hanged for murder." Alexander moved with surprising speed for a man of his size, positioning himself between Eleanor and the intruder with cold fury evident in every line of his body. "You are drunk, Warrington, and trespassing on my property," he stated flatly. "You will leave immediately, or be removed." Warrington laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor as he reached inside his coat to produce a folded document, stained with either age or the rain through which he had traveled. "Ask him about the letter, Lady Eleanor," he urged, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone that made her skin crawl. "Ask him what really happened that night." Alexander lunged forward then, all pretense of civility abandoned as he grasped Warrington by his sodden lapels and physically lifted him away from Eleanor, his voice a dangerous growl as he demanded the other man leave his home and never return. Warrington reacted with unexpected violence, his fist connecting with Alexander's jaw, with enough force to send the Duke staggering backward, the letter falling forgotten to the carpet as the men grappled with each other, overturning a side table and sending books crashing to the floor in their struggle. Eleanor stood frozen for only a moment before diving for the fallen document, her fingers closing around the damp paper as the sound of breaking glass punctuated the men's grunts of exertion. She unfolded it with trembling hands to find a physician's account of Lucia Van's death, noting signs of bruising that might indicate a struggle before her drowning, words that cast Alexander in a damning light. Indeed, if one were inclined to interpret them as evidence of foul play rather than the desperate attempts to save a drowning woman. The moment stretched like blown glass as Eleanor faced her choice, The letter in her hands potentially ruinous to the man she'd grown to love despite his initial motives, the accusations of a known villain ringing in her ears as the storm raged both within and without the walls of Thornfield. With deliberate movements, she crossed to the fireplace and cast the document into the flames, turning to face Warrington with steel in her spine as she ordered him from her home, her decision made to stand with her husband regardless of the doubts that still whispered in the darkest corners of her heart. Dawn crept through the windows of Alexander's private chambers, the same rooms where Eleanor had first confronted the Winter Duke months earlier, now transformed by gentle morning light that painted the dark furnishings with strokes of gold and amber. Eleanor had barely slept following Warrington's violent expulsion from Thornfield, her mind racing with questions still unanswered, despite her choice to stand with her husband. Restless exploration of Alexander's desk while he slept had revealed a hidden compartment containing a letter she had not burned, not the physician's account but something far more intimate, written in a delicate feminine hand upon paper now yellowed with age. Heart-pounding, Eleanor unfolded Lucia's final message, written the very morning of her death, confessing the depths of melancholia that had consumed her since losing their child, describing hallucinations and terrors that plagued her day and night, despite Alexander's tireless efforts to help her recover. "My beloved husband has been my only anchor in this darkness," Lucia had written, her words occasionally blurred by what must have been tears. "He has shown such patience, such tenderness. Yet I cannot escape the shadows that consume me, cannot be the wife he deserves, or the mother our son will never know." The letter continued with heart-rending clarity, detailing Alexander's attempts to secure the finest physicians, his nights spent at her bedside, his love that could not penetrate the illness consuming her mind. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as she read the final lines, absolving Alexander of all blame and begging whoever found the letter to ensure he did not punish himself for what she alone had chosen. A sound from the doorway alerted her to Alexander's presence, his tall figure silhouetted against the corridor light, his expression unreadable as he observed her with the evidence of his innocence trembling in her hands. She rose on unsteady legs, crossing to him with the letter extended like an offering, a bridge across the chasm that had separated them since the beginning. "You tried to save her," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You loved her so completely." Alexander took the letter with reverent hands, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face as dawn light illuminated the tears on her cheeks. "I've lived in winter so long, Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with emotion that had been suppressed for years. "I never expected to feel warmth again until you." His confession hung in the air between them, fragile as the first crocuses pushing through frozen ground, and Eleanor moved toward him as if drawn by an invisible force, her hand reaching up to touch his face, with a tenderness that made him close his eyes in surrender. When their lips finally met, it was not with the hesitancy of strangers but with the certainty of souls who had found in each other something thought forever lost, his arms enfolding her against his chest as the last barriers between them crumbled like the walls of winter, yielding at last to the irresistible warmth of spring. The gardens of Thornfield Hall blazed with colours unseen on the estate for nearly a decade, roses climbing stone walls with renewed vigour, formal beds overflowing with tulips and hyacinths, fruit trees heavy with fragrant blossoms that promised abundant harvests in months to come. 1 year after the tumultuous events that had forever altered the course of their lives, Eleanor stood beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak, one hand resting protectively on her rounded belly where new life grew, watching as Alexander crouched among a group of tenant children, demonstrating how to fashion whistles from hollow reeds collected from the lake shore. His laughter, once so rare within these grounds, now rang frequently through halls and gardens that seemed to respond to his transformation with their own rebirth. Winter giving way to perpetual spring, as the man previously known throughout society as the Duke of Winter rediscovered joys long forgotten. Sensing her presence, Alexander looked up, his grey eyes finding hers with the warmth that now characterized his gaze whenever it fell upon his duchess. He excused himself from the children and crossed the lawn to join her, his hand automatically reaching for hers as they strolled along paths recently cleared of decades of neglect. "You pretended to faint to escape a man you feared," he said softly, his thumb tracing gentle patterns on her palm, only to fall into the arms of a man you came to love. Eleanor smiled up at him, still marveling at the journey that had brought them from that London ballroom to this moment of profound contentment. Together they continued their walk toward the East Wing, no longer locked and forbidden, but open to light and air, the rooms that had once preserved grief like fragile artifacts, now transformed into a bright nursery awaiting the child whose movements Eleanor felt daily beneath her heart. The cradle from that preserved room remained, but now it stood in a chamber painted with scenes from fairy tales, surrounded by toys and books and all the hopeful preparations of parents who had found in each other the healing neither had believed possible. Alexander had insisted on painting the murals himself, the same talented hands that had once captured Lucius' likeness, now creating magical forests and friendly beasts to watch over their child. The act itself, a kind of exorcism that allowed him to honor the past while embracing the future they would share. As evening approached, they made their way back through gardens where groundsmen pruned and planted with renewed purpose. Thornfield Hall itself, seeming to stand taller against the spring sky, no longer a monument to grief, but a home where life had returned in full measure. The Duke of Thornfield and his Duchess walked hand in hand beneath trees bursting with new leaves, two souls who had found in each other's arms not just love, but redemption. The wounds of their pasts transformed into the foundation of a future neither could have imagined when fate first brought them together with a pretended feint and an unexpected rescue.